Hello! Welcome to another episode of Learn to Trigger Intermediate. Today I'm going to be teaching you a topic that may strike fear into your heart. It may make you want to run and scream. It is excess user code. Relax, it's not really as dramatic as you think it is. Let's just give you a very basic example of what I mean. Okay, so if we go into triggers, you will have seen this before, excess user code and the foreboding code box, where you might think, what on earth goes in here? So, let's just do something very basic and not too unsurprising. So I'm going to set this to a timer of 2 seconds, and then my code is going to run. What code am I going to put in here? I'm going to do this. And that's it. That's all I'm doing. Let's see what happens. So you see that now, this time, I've just sent a check message from player 0. That's all I've done. So that's a very basic but genuine use of excess code. So you're probably going to recognize what I've just done there. So let me explain. So this is my trigger code, and that was my excess user code. That's the code I typed into the button, and you'll have seen that if I sent a chat from player 0 just saying hello, that's exactly what would have been outputted into the trigtemp file. So excess is the trigger code language that Age of Mythology uses. So I've essentially written my own trigger for sending a chat from player 0 with the excess user code function. I've just coded it myself. So that's all it is really. It's just letting us directly input trigger code into Age of Mythology as a block line. It's quite simple. We can do this with quite a lot of other things as well. It's not just related to chats. Back in the editor, I've managed to code quite a lot just using excess. So there's two different effects here. There's just the raw code, and then there's code where you can select a unit. That's if the unit must be selected in order for the code to be applied. So here I'm changing the unit name to Yibogun. You can't just put that as raw code, because Age of Mythology is quite rightly going to ask, well, what unit should I apply this to? That's the need to select the unit to apply the code to. And if we test it, because I've just done these triggers as normal, copied from the trigtemp, you see I get exactly the same output. So I've got my message, I've got the name, I've got the hit points, I even got a gong sound playing. So with excess, that's the take-home message. You can do anything with triggers that you can do with excess. Now I'm going to show you a few things that you can do with excess that you can't do with triggers, and that's what's going to make excess special. So on this map, I have got 8 old men, all belonging to different players. Now, often the bane of trigger designers is if you want to modify the stats of units and you've got a very large scenario and you just have to keep on copying for every single player just for the stats. And if you want to do shops, if you want to do god powers, if you want to have any special abilities, you've got to copy everything for every player. It's a pain. With excess code, you don't have to do this. So what I did was I playtested this scenario. I then went into the trigtemp and copied the excess user code for this trigger here. So what that turned up with was this: modify proto unit, old man, player 1, field ID 0, so that's corresponding to the index of the drop down list. Hit points is first, so that's 0, and 850.0 as a float to add to our 150 to get to 1000. If I run it, it's going to work, but let's say we want to do it for all the players at once without copying. So you'll remember that before I used a while loop to make sure that the code would only progress after a certain condition had been met. There's another way of doing this in excess. What we can now do is we can use a for loop. So this takes the form of for, then an integer that we define customly. So I'm going to say p, that's going to be short for player. I'm going to define it as 1, and I want AOM to loop through that until the result is 8, because I've got 8 old man. So I will do this code. So this will loop the integer p for all values where it is 1 up to 9. I've got an open square bracket here, so that's what this one here is for, the excess code. I'm going to close that square bracket. I now need to use this integer which we've defined here. Where are we going to put it? We're going to put it where we want our player. So I'm replacing player 1 with p. So p isn't normally a number, but I've defined it as an integer here, so it will take this code. If I playtest the scenario, you'll see that player 1's old man has 1,000 hit points, as does 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to player 8. So that's the code working. If I were to reduce that number, say to 5, and test again just to prove a point, you'd find that player 3 and 4 have hit points of 1,000, but player 5 does not. This becomes so useful. So with this excess user code, by using these for loops, we can have a vast amount of data very quickly. What we can also do within these brackets, if you wanted to, because we've defined our p integer, we don't have to use excess user code for everything. We just could have a modified proto unit in here, and we could set it up like this, and we replace player with p. Simple. You might not be able to do this on the triggers that you've got. This is because when Not had redesigned his 2.8 triggers, he changed most of these boxes from integers to strings, so you can still have your numbers and you can type as usual. It's just not an option to have a drop down, but you can actually put other things in there, like what I've just done here. You can see exactly the same setup and exactly the same effect. This doesn't just stop with players and player numbers, it can also affect units. So how does Asian mythology work with units? You'll see that each unit is given an ID and a name, and when you first start a scenario, those will just increase the more you place, starting with 0. If we were to delete a unit, you'd find that ID and name would be preserved. However, in the previous one, when we put a new unit down, it's going to be slightly differently behaved. So our name is still incrementing in order, but our ID is not. No idea why it's doing this number, it's just AOM things. So a unit has two identities. We can select it by name and we can select it by ID. If we wanted to damage our units, we wouldn't be able to use a setup like this. We need to use something differently. So we'd need tr unit selects, because this is how AOM does it, and this command takes the form of a string. So we'd need to convert our integer to a string like so, and then we could have our damage unit effect, and then we'd close the square bracket that was open, curly bracket, sorry, and once we test it, we'll hear the instant screams of all the old men dying. So there's a huge possibility with excess code. I'm only scratching the surface here. Next, there's going to be a challenge scenario where I want you to use what you've learned about excess code to make a shop for multiple players all at once with simple excess code rather than copying it from player to player. I'll see you in the next video.